The rope around my wrists was still wet with morning dew, when I realized my bride-to-be might be the most dangerous woman in all of England. The rough hemp bit into my skin as I tested the bonds, wondering how a simple arrangement for land had led me to this moment, tied to a chair in what used to be my own bedchamber. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 days ago, I thought I was the luckiest man in Yorkshire. Now I wasn't sure I'd live to see another sunset. But to understand how I got here, I must tell you about the day they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. It was late September, and the autumn winds were already stripping the last stubborn leaves from the oak trees surrounding Windermere Hall, the modest estate that had been in my family for 3 generations. I say modest because that's exactly what it was, barely large enough to support my father's gambling debts and my mother's expensive tastes. As the younger son of a minor lord, I had grown accustomed to watching opportunities slip through my fingers like water. My name is Gareth Windermere, and at 26, I had resigned myself to a life of genteel poverty, watching my older brother inherit what little remained of our family's holdings while I scraped together enough coin to maintain appearances at court. It's a bitter thing, being born into nobility without the means to sustain it. You learn to smile while your boots leak, to bow gracefully while your stomach growls, and to speak of honor when what you really need is land. That morning, I was in the estate's crumbling library, trying to make sense of our accounts, when our steward announced a visitor. Lord Aldwyn Ashworth had arrived without warning, accompanied by a small retinue, and wearing the kind of rich velvet doublet that reminded me exactly how poor we become. I had heard of Ashworth, of course. Everyone in the northern counties knew his name. He controlled vast holdings across 3 shires, and was rumored to have the ear of several powerful men at court. I received him in our great hall, such as it was, with its faded tapestries and cold fireplace. We couldn't afford to keep fires burning during the day anymore. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with steel-gray hair and the kind of calculating eyes that suggested he saw profit in everything. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He looked around our humble surroundings with what might have been amusement, then fixed those sharp eyes on me. "Lord Gareth," he said, though we both knew the title was a courtesy at best, "I come with a proposition that could change your circumstances considerably." I gestured for him to sit, offering what hospitality we could manage. "I'm listening, my lord." He settled himself in one of our better chairs, the one we saved for important guests, though it too had seen better days. "I have a ward," he began, "a young woman of good breeding who has reached marriageable age. She requires a husband of noble blood, someone who can provide her with the protection and status her position demands." I waited, knowing there had to be more. Men like Ashworth didn't travel to failing estates to offer charity. He smiled, as if reading my thoughts. "In return for this service, I am prepared to grant you the deed to Thornwick Manor and its surrounding lands. Perhaps you know it? 500 acres of the finest farmland in the county, complete with a fully operational mill and 3 tenant villages." My breath caught. Thornwick Manor was legendary in our area, a prosperous holding that generated more income in a year than our entire estate had seen in the last 5. It was the kind of property that could restore not just my fortunes, but my family's entire standing. That's extraordinarily generous. I managed, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. "What manner of protection does your ward require? Is there some danger I should be aware of?" His expression grew serious. "The young woman has lived a rather sheltered life. There are circumstances surrounding her birth that make discretion essential. She will come to you veiled, as is proper for a maiden of her particular station, and I trust you will respect her modesty until after the ceremony." Something cold settled in my stomach. Veiled until after the ceremony? That's somewhat unusual, isn't it? Perhaps, he acknowledged with a slight shrug. But these are the terms. You will marry her within the week, provide her with your name and protection, and in return, Thornwick Manor becomes yours immediately upon completion of the ceremony. The marriage contracts have already been drawn up. I stared at him, my mind racing. A veiled bride suggested either disfigurement or identity concealment, neither of which boded well. But Thornwick Manor represented everything I had ever wanted. Security, respect, a future worth living. Tell me in the comments, have you ever made a deal that seemed too good to be true? Because as I sat there, looking at Lord Ashworth's confident smile, Every instinct I possessed was screaming that this arrangement came with a price I couldn't yet see. I would need to know something about her character, I said carefully. Her education, her temperament. Surely you can tell me that much about the woman I'm to marry. He nodded, as if he had expected the question. She is well educated, speaks several languages, and has been raised with all the accomplishments expected of a lady. As for her temperament, I believe you will find her intriguing. She has a mind of her own, which some might see as a challenge, but I suspect a man of your intelligence would appreciate wit in a wife. And her family? Her connections? For just a moment, something flickered across his features. Pride, perhaps, or satisfaction. Let us say that her bloodline is impeccable, though circumstances require discretion about its exact nature. The important thing is that this union will elevate your status considerably, while providing her with the protection she needs. I found myself nodding, though warning bells continued to ring in my head. When would this ceremony take place? 3 days hence. I have already arranged for Father Benedict from St. Mary's to perform the service. A small ceremony, family only, as befits her particular circumstances. 3 days. Barely enough time to think, let alone investigate. But as I looked around our shabby hall, at the cracked plaster and the empty spaces where valuable pieces had been sold to pay debts, I knew I couldn't afford to be cautious. This was opportunity presenting itself, and I had learned the hard way that such chances rarely came twice. I accept, I heard myself say, and Lord Ashworth's smile widened. Excellent. She will arrive tomorrow evening, along with her personal effects and a small household staff. I trust you'll ensure she's made comfortable. He stood, straightening his doublet. Oh, and Gareth? A word of advice. Your bride has lived a very protected life. Don't be surprised if she seems overwhelmed by the change in circumstances. Patience will serve you well. As I watched his party ride away, their horses' hooves echoing in the courtyard, I tried to convince myself I had made the right choice. Borwick Manor was real, substantial, everything I needed to secure my future. Whatever secrets my veiled bride carried, surely they couldn't be worse than a lifetime of genteel poverty. What they didn't tell me was that my bride came with secrets that could topple the crown. The next evening arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into the very stones of Windermere Hall. I had spent the day in a state of nervous energy, directing our few remaining servants in preparing chambers for my mysterious bride and her household. My mother, bless her romantic heart, had insisted on bringing out what little finery we still possessed, decorating the main guest chambers with our last good linens and the silver candlesticks we'd somehow managed to keep from the creditors. She arrived as the sun was setting, a small procession of 3 carriages winding up our tree-lined drive. I watched from the window of my study, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman who would become my wife, but the lead carriage had heavy curtains drawn tight against the autumn air. Lord Ashworth rode alongside on a magnificent black stallion, and I noticed that several armed men accompanied the party. More protection than seemed necessary for a simple ward traveling to her wedding. I met them in the courtyard, doing my best to appear the gracious host despite my growing unease. The servants who emerged from the carriages were well-dressed and efficient, clearly accustomed to serving someone of considerable importance. They began unloading trunks and cases with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for precious cargo. But it was Lord Ashworth who commanded my attention as he dismounted. His expression was more serious than it had been during our previous meeting, and when he approached me, he spoke in low, urgent tones. Remember what I told you about discretion, Gareth. Your bride is delicate. She has been through considerable upheaval recently, and this marriage represents safety for her in ways you cannot yet understand. He glanced toward the lead carriage, where a cloaked figure was being helped down by 2 female attendants. Even at a distance, I could see she was slender, graceful in her movements, but the heavy veil that covered her from head to nearly her feet revealed nothing of her features. Has something happened? I asked, noting the tension in his voice. You seem more concerned than when we last spoke. He was quiet for a moment, watching as his ward was escorted toward the main entrance of our hall. Let us say that recent events at court have made her situation more precarious than anticipated. Your protection, your name, these things are not merely conveniences now. They may well be necessities. Before I could ask what he meant, he had moved away to oversee the unloading of what appeared to be a considerable dowry. chests that required 2 men to carry, cases that clinked with the sound of precious metals, and rolled tapestries that spoke of wealth far beyond anything I had expected. This was no ordinary ward seeking a convenient marriage. This was someone of substantial means, who needed to disappear into the obscurity of a minor estate. My bride, if I could call her that before we had even been properly introduced, paused at the entrance to our hall. She turned back toward me, and though I could see nothing of her face through the veil, I felt the weight of her regard like a physical thing. There was intelligence there, assessment, perhaps even apprehension. She curtsied with perfect grace, a gesture so elegant it spoke of years of court training, then allowed herself to be led inside. I followed, my mind churning with questions I couldn't ask and implications I didn't want to consider. In our great hall, she stood surrounded by her attendants, a figure of mystery in our humble surroundings. The contrast was striking. Her clothing, what I could see of it beneath the cloak, was of the finest quality. Her posture spoke of noble breeding, and when she moved, it was with the kind of controlled grace that came from years of careful instruction in courtly behavior. "My lord," one of her attendants said, curtsying to me, "Lady Lyanna is grateful for your hospitality. She hopes you will forgive her reticence. The journey has been taxing, and she would prefer to retire early this evening." Lady Lyanna. At least I had a name now, though it told me nothing about who she really was, or why she needed to hide behind veils and armed escorts. I bowed formally, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Of course. Please tell Lady Lyanna that she is welcome in our home, and that I hope she will find comfort here." I gestured toward the stairs. "The chambers have been prepared according to Lord Ashworth's specifications." As she was led away, I caught the faintest trace of her scent, something subtle and expensive that reminded me of the gardens at court. But more than that, I heard her voice for the first time as she murmured something to one of her attendants. It was cultured, educated, with the kind of precise diction that came from the finest tutoring. This was no merchant's daughter or minor noble's ward. This was a woman who had been raised in circles far above my own. That night, I found it impossible to sleep. I paced my chambers, trying to make sense of what I had committed myself to. The dowry alone was worth a fortune, far more than would be reasonable for a simple marriage arrangement. The secrecy, the armed guards, the urgency in Lord Ashworth's demeanor, it all pointed to something far more complex than he had initially revealed. I was still awake when I heard voices in the corridor outside my room. Moving quietly to the door, I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. It was Lord Ashworth, speaking in hushed but urgent tones to someone I couldn't identify. "The situation at court has deteriorated faster than we anticipated," he was saying. "There are rumors, whispers about her true parentage. If certain parties were to discover her location before the marriage is completed, the ceremony must proceed as planned." Another voice replied, this one unfamiliar but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Once she bears the Windermere name, she'll have legal protection that even her enemies will find difficult to circumvent." My blood ran cold. Enemies? What manner of woman had I agreed to marry? I strained to hear more, but their voices had dropped to whispers I couldn't make out. When I finally heard footsteps moving away down the corridor, I remained frozen by the door, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. Lady Lyanna took breakfast in her chambers, communicated only through her attendants, and remained as much of a mystery as when she had arrived. Lord Ashworth had departed early, claiming business elsewhere but promising to return for the wedding ceremony. Before leaving, he had pulled me aside once more. "Tomorrow you become not just a husband, but a protector," he had said, his eyes grave. "I pray you understand the weight of that responsibility." I had nodded, though I understood nothing at all. As I watched his party disappear down our drive, I realized that I was now alone in my own home with a woman whose very presence might bring danger to everything I held dear. The night before my wedding, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. I had spent most of that sleepless night trying to convince myself that I was imagining threats where none existed, but the morning of my wedding brought with it an atmosphere so thick with tension that even our servants seemed to move with unusual caution. The weather had turned ominous overnight, with heavy clouds gathering on the horizon and a wind that rattled the shutters, like skeletal fingers demanding entry. Father Benedict arrived early, a thin man with nervous eyes who seemed far too anxious for someone simply performing a wedding ceremony. He kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting unwanted visitors, and when I attempted to make polite conversation about the service, his responses were clipped and distracted. This was not the jovial priest I remembered from village celebrations. "The ceremony will be brief," he informed me, clutching his prayer book with white-knuckled intensity. "Lord Ashworth has requested that we proceed with minimal formality." Minimal formality. Another strange element in an arrangement that grew more peculiar by the hour. What bride didn't want a proper wedding ceremony? What guardian insisted on such secrecy that even the priest seemed frightened? My mother, bless her innocent heart, bustled about trying to create some semblance of celebration despite the circumstances. She had managed to gather a few wildflowers from our garden and arrange them in our best silver vase, the one piece of true value we still possessed. Her excitement was genuine, though I could see concern creeping into her eyes as she observed the general atmosphere of unease. "She's lovely, isn't she?" she whispered to me as we waited in the hall. "I caught just a glimpse of her hand yesterday when she was being helped from the carriage. Such delicate fingers. And did you see the quality of that ring she wears? This is a fortunate match, my son." A ring. I filed the detail away, wondering what other clues I might have missed in my nervousness. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of my bride. She descended slowly, still veiled, but now wearing what was unmistakably a wedding gown of extraordinary quality. The fabric caught the light from our windows in ways that spoke of silk imported from the finest weavers, and the intricate embroidery along the hem suggested the work of master craftsmen. Behind her came her attendants, and I noticed for the first time how alert they seemed, how their eyes constantly moved to check the windows and doors. These were not ordinary ladies' maids. They moved with the controlled awareness of people trained to recognize danger. As she approached, I caught my first real glimpse of her figure. She was slender but not frail, moving with a natural grace that suggested strength beneath the delicate appearance. Her hands, visible now as they held a small prayer book, were indeed beautiful as my mother had noted, but it was the ring that captured my attention. Even through my nervousness, I could see it was no ordinary piece of jewelry. The stone caught the light with a brilliance that spoke of exceptional quality, and the setting appeared to be of a style I associated with court jewelry. Father Benedict began the ceremony with unseemly haste, rushing through the traditional words as if demons were pursuing him. When we reached the moment for exchanging vows, I spoke mine clearly, though my voice carried more uncertainty than confidence. But when my bride spoke, promising to honor and cherish me as her husband, there was something in her tone that made me look at her more carefully. Her voice was steady, but I detected an underlying sadness that had nothing to do with wedding nerves. This was a woman who understood exactly what she was sacrificing, who was entering this marriage not from choice but from necessity. The realization struck me with unexpected force. Whatever her circumstances, whatever had brought her to this point, she was as much a victim of these arrangements as I was a beneficiary. The moment arrived for lifting her veil. Father Benedict nodded nervously, and I reached forward with hands that trembled slightly. As the fabric fell away, I found myself looking into the most beautiful face I had ever seen. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped my breath. It was her eyes. They were the color of winter storms, gray-blue and intelligent, but filled with a wariness that spoke of recent pain. High cheekbones and perfectly shaped lips gave her an aristocratic bearing that would have been notable in any court, but it was the expression of barely contained fear that made my heart clench with unexpected protectiveness. She was young, perhaps 22, with golden hair that had been arranged in the elaborate style favored by court ladies. But more than her physical appearance, there was something about her bearing, her manner of holding herself, that whispered of royal training. This was not merely nobility. This was someone who had been raised among the highest circles of power. "You may kiss your bride," Father Benedict said quickly, and I leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her lips. They were soft and warm, but I felt her tremble at the contact. When I pulled back, our eyes met, and I saw something there that made my pulse quicken. Recognition, perhaps, or relief, but also a question that seemed to ask whether I could be trusted with whatever secrets she carried. The ceremony concluded with indecent haste, and as Father Benedict gathered his things and made ready to depart, I noticed him pressing a sealed letter into the hands of one of my wife's attendants. More correspondence, more secrets, more evidence that this marriage was part of some larger design I couldn't comprehend. If you're enjoying this tale of mystery and romance, please subscribe to our channel for more historical love stories that will keep you captivated. Now, as our small wedding party moved to the dining hall for what my mother had optimistically called a wedding feast, I found myself walking beside my new wife in complete silence. She had replaced her veil, though less completely than before, and I could see her profile as she moved with careful grace beside me. "Lady Lyanna," I said quietly, using her name for the first time, "I hope you will be comfortable here. I know these circumstances are unusual." She turned to look at me, and I caught a glimpse of surprise in those remarkable eyes. "You are kind, my lord. Kinder than I had dared hope." Her voice was soft, cultured, with an accent that spoke of the finest education. "I pray that I will not bring you more trouble than benefit." There was something prophetic in those words that made me study her face more carefully. What kind of trouble was she expecting? What did she know about her own situation that I had not been told? Before I could respond, we had reached the dining hall where my mother had arranged our meager celebration. As we took our places at the head table, I noticed that my wife ate very little, though she made polite conversation with my mother about the flowers and the meal. But her attendants, I observed, positioned themselves strategically around the room, and I caught one of them checking the windows several times during our meal. They were watching for something, or someone. It was as we were finishing the simple meal that one of the attendants approached and whispered something urgent in my wife's ear. I saw her face go pale, saw her hands clench in her lap, and watched as she rose quickly from her chair. "Forgive me," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I find myself quite fatigued. Perhaps I might retire early?" My mother, ever the gracious hostess, immediately began fussing about ensuring her comfort, but I was watching my wife's face. This wasn't fatigue. This was fear. Something had changed. Some news had arrived that had shattered whatever composure she had maintained throughout the day. As she was escorted from the hall, I caught her glance back at me once, and what I saw in her eyes made my blood run cold. It was the look of someone who expected this to be the last peaceful moment she would know. Whatever forces had driven her to seek the protection of marriage to a stranger, they were closing in, and my wedding night was about to become something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. As I held that necklace, I realized I hadn't married just anyone. I had married someone whose very existence threatened the stability of the crown itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the hours that led to that earth-shattering discovery. The evening had settled into an uneasy quiet after my wife's abrupt departure from our wedding feast. My mother, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, had retired early with whispered concerns about my bride's health. I remained in the great hall, nursing a cup of wine and trying to make sense of the day's events, when I heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching at speed. Through the window, I could see torches moving up our drive, far too many for a casual visit. My heart began to race as I counted at least a dozen riders, all armed, all moving with the purposeful urgency of men on official business. This was not a social call. I was still processing this development when one of my wife's attendants, the older woman who seemed to be in charge of the others, appeared at my elbow. Her face was grave, her manner urgent. "My lord," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "you must come quickly. Lady Lyanna needs to speak with you immediately. It cannot wait." Something in her tone brooked no argument. I followed her up the stairs, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. She led me not to the guest chambers where I had expected to find my wife, but to a small sitting room that connected to what had once been my grandmother's quarters. Lady Lyanna was there, pacing before the fireplace with an agitation that was completely at odds with the composed woman I had married hours earlier. She had changed from her wedding gown into a simpler dress, but it was her face that stopped me cold. The careful mask of serenity had vanished, replaced by an expression of desperate determination. "Gareth," she said, using my name for the first time, "we have very little time, and there are things you must know before those riders reach our door." "What riders?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Men who have been searching for me across 3 counties, she replied, moving to the window to peer through the curtains. Men who will not hesitate to use force to take me back to London if they believe they have legal grounds to do so. And do they? I found myself asking, though I dreaded the answer. She turned to face me, and in the candlelight I could see tears gathering in those storm-colored eyes. That depends entirely on whether you can find it in your heart to protect someone who has deceived you about almost everything. Before I could respond, she was moving toward a small chest that sat on the room's writing desk. With trembling fingers, she opened it and withdrew something that caught the firelight like captured starshine. It was a necklace, but not just any necklace. Even in the dim light, I could see it was extraordinary. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, holding it toward me with hands that shook. I stepped closer, and my breath caught. The central stone was a sapphire of remarkable size and clarity, surrounded by diamonds arranged in a pattern I had seen before in portraits and official ceremonies. This was not merely expensive jewelry. This was a piece of the crown jewels. "How do you come to possess this?" I whispered, afraid to voice the implications that were racing through my mind. "Because it was given to my mother," she replied, her voice breaking slightly, "by the man who loved her despite the fact that it could have cost him his throne." The room seemed to spin around me. "Your mother?" "Lady Catherine Pemberton. Perhaps you've heard the name whispered in certain circles. She was lady-in-waiting to the Queen 15 years ago, until she disappeared from court rather suddenly." Lyanna's voice was steady now, but I could hear the pain beneath the control. "She disappeared because she was carrying the king's child. She disappeared because she was carrying me." I sank into a chair, my mind struggling to process what she had just revealed. "You're telling me that you are a bastard daughter of the King of England," she finished quietly. "Hidden away all these years, raised in secret, protected by my mother's family until recently. But certain people at court have begun asking questions about my mother's disappearance, about whether she might have left behind any complications." The sound of horses in our courtyard was growing louder now, accompanied by voices raised in authority. I could hear our stable boy protesting, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of so many armed men. "Lord Ashworth," I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Easier. My grandfather. My mother's father. He has protected me as long as he could, but there are those who would see me eliminated rather than risk any challenge to the succession. Marriage to you gives me legal protection as your wife, makes me your responsibility rather than a ward of the crown." Footsteps were echoing in our great hall now, heavy boots that spoke of military authority. Someone was demanding entrance, demanding to speak with the master of the house. But all I could focus on was the woman standing before me, this beautiful stranger who had just revealed herself to be perhaps the most dangerous secret in all of England. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why now?" "Because they're here for me," she said simply. "And because you deserve to know what you're risking if you choose to honor your wedding vows." She held out the necklace, its jewels catching the candlelight like fallen stars. "This is my proof, my only evidence of who I am. If they take me tonight, this necklace disappears forever, and with it any claim I might have to legitimacy. Let me know where you're watching from, because I love hearing from viewers around the world." Now, the pounding on our front door was becoming insistent, accompanied by official proclamations about the king's business. I could hear my mother's frightened voice asking questions that no one was answering. I looked at Lyanna, at this woman who had trusted me with a secret that could reshape the kingdom, and felt something shift inside my chest. This wasn't just about land anymore, or even about honor. This was about protecting someone who had nowhere else to turn, someone who had placed her life in my inexperienced hands. "What do they want?" I asked, moving to stand beside her at the window. "To take me back to London, where I can be quietly disposed of. There are whispers that the king is ill, that questions of succession are becoming more pressing. A bastard daughter, even one with no legitimate claim, represents a complication that certain people would prefer not to exist." I could see the riders now, clustered in our courtyard. Their leader, a man in rich clothing with the bearing of court nobility, was dismounting while his men remained alert and ready. This was not a request. This was a demand backed by force. "Gareth," Lyanna said quietly, "I need you to know that if you choose to let them take me, I will understand. You never agreed to put yourself in danger for a stranger's secrets. But if you choose to stand with me, to claim your rights as my husband, then we face whatever comes next together." The choice was mine, and I had perhaps minutes to make it. Protect the woman who had just revealed herself to be royal blood, or step aside and let forces beyond my understanding take her away to an uncertain fate. As I looked into her eyes, seeing hope and fear warring there in equal measure, I realized that my answer would define not just her future, but the man I chose to become. I reached for that necklace, taking it from her trembling hands. The sapphire was warm against my palm, as if it held within it all the secrets and sorrows of the royal line. I looked into Lyanna's eyes, and saw my own reflection there, a man who was about to either become a hero or a fool. "Then we face it together," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "You are my wife now, and no one takes my wife from my home." I had one choice that would determine both our fates, and as the relief flooded Lyanna's face at my declaration, I knew there was no going back. She had been carrying this burden alone for so long, expecting abandonment at every turn, that my simple promise of loyalty seemed to transform her entirely. For the first time since I had met her, she looked truly beautiful, not because her features had changed, but because hope had replaced the fear that had shadowed them. The pounding on our door had reached a crescendo now, accompanied by my mother's increasingly distressed voice trying to manage a situation far beyond her understanding. I could hear furniture being moved, the sound of many men entering our hall, the clink of weapons, and spurs on stone. They weren't waiting for permission anymore. "Sir Roderick Blackwood," Lyanna whispered, her face going pale again as she peered through the curtains. "I should have known he would come personally." "Who is he?" "The king's cousin, and the man who stands to gain the most if questions about the royal succession remain simple and uncomplicated. He's the one who has been hunting me, the one who arranged for certain documents about my mother to disappear from the royal archives." Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of long acquaintance with betrayal. "He was also the one who tried to convince the king that my mother had been unfaithful with multiple men, making any child she bore suspect." Heavy footsteps were climbing our stairs now, accompanied by the metallic sound of armed men moving with purpose. Whatever conversation was happening in our great hall, it was over, and they were coming to collect what they believed belonged to them. "Stay behind me," I told Lyanna, moving to position myself between her and the door. "Whatever happens, you are Lady Windermere now, and I will not let them forget it." The door burst open without ceremony, revealing Sir Roderick Blackwood himself flanked by 4 armed guards. He was a man of middle years, with a kind of cruel handsomeness that spoke of ruthless ambition dressed in courtly manners. His eyes swept the room, taking in every detail, before settling on Lyanna with an expression of cold satisfaction. "Lady Catherine's bastard," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of court nobility wrapped around words of pure venom. "You have led us quite a chase across the northern counties." "You address my wife, sir," I said, stepping forward, "and you do so in my home." "I'll thank you to remember both facts." His laugh was like winter wine through dead leaves. "Your wife? How charming. Tell me, Lord Windermere, did your dear bride mention her interesting parentage when she accepted your proposal? Or were you as ignorant as most of the pawns in this game?" "I know everything I need to know," I replied, meeting his stare with what I hoped was convincing confidence. "I know that she is legally my wife, married before witnesses, and under the protection of my name and house." "Protection?" Sir Roderick's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "From what?" "She is a bastard with no legitimate claim to anything, a young woman who has been living on the charity of her grandfather and feeding herself on impossible dreams. She is my wife," I repeated, "and that is all the legitimacy she requires." "Ah, but you see, that's where you're mistaken," Sir Roderick said, producing a rolled parchment from inside his doublet. "I carry here a warrant signed by the king himself, ordering the return of one Catherine Pemberton's daughter for questioning regarding certain irregularities in the royal household." But then something unexpected happened. The sound of many horses approaching at speed echoed through the night air, and Sir Roderick's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. Through the window, I could see new torches, a different party of riders moving up our drive with their own sense of urgent purpose. "Impossible," Sir Roderick muttered, moving to the window. But it wasn't impossible at all. Lord Ashworth swept into our courtyard at the head of what looked like a small army, accompanied by banners I recognized, colors that belonged to some of the most powerful noble houses in the north. "It seems," Lyanna said quietly, a note of fierce satisfaction in her voice, "that my grandfather has been busy since our wedding. Tell me, Sir Roderick, how do you suppose it will look when word reaches court that you threatened to burn the estate of a legally married couple based on nothing more than your own suspicions?" The sound of many feet entering our hall echoed up the stairs, followed by Lord Ashworth's voice demanding to know by what authority his granddaughter's home had been invaded. The game had changed completely, and Sir Roderick's men were now vastly outnumbered by lords, whose loyalty to the crown was unquestionable. "Sir Roderick," Lord Ashworth's voice carried clearly up the stairs, formal and implacable, "you will explain by what authority you have invaded the home of my granddaughter and her lawfully wedded husband." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Sir Roderick could hardly claim royal authority for what was beginning to look suspiciously like a personal vendetta, especially not in front of witnesses whose own positions at court were secure. His hastily produced warrant seemed far less intimidating when faced with the combined authority of 3 earls, 2 barons, and Lord Ashworth himself. "This matter is not concluded," Sir Roderick said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, as he realized his defeat. "There will be other opportunities to address these concerns through proper channels." "Indeed there will," Lord Ashworth agreed pleasantly, as he entered our chamber. "I look forward to presenting Lady Windermere and her husband at court when next we are summoned. I believe His Majesty would be quite interested to meet his new subject and hear her account of recent events." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Any further attempts to move against Lyanna would have to be conducted in the full light of court scrutiny, with witnesses and proper legal proceedings. The shadowy persecution that Sir Roderick preferred was no longer possible. As the sound of Sir Roderick's party preparing for departure echoed through the house, Lyanna turned to me with tears streaming down her face. But these were not tears of fear or sorrow. These were tears of relief so profound that her entire body was shaking with the force of them. "You stayed," she whispered, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. "When you learned who I was, what danger I represented, you chose to protect me anyway. You are my wife," I said simply, reaching up to brush away her tears. "That was never in question." The weeks and months that followed brought changes to our lives that I could never have anticipated. Thornwick Manor proved to be every bit as prosperous as promised, and the marriage that had begun as a desperate arrangement blossomed into something neither of us had dared hope for. Lyanna transformed from the frightened, veiled woman who had arrived at my door into a confident lady of the manor, who won the hearts of our tenants with her genuine concern for their welfare. Sir Roderick's failure became the talk of court circles, and his heavy-handed tactics earned him powerful enemies, who viewed his persecution of a legally married couple as dangerous to their own interests. The new king, when he eventually ascended the throne, proved to be far more interested in loyalty and competence than in pursuing old grudges, and he even expressed admiration for Lyanna's educational initiatives throughout the kingdom. As I write this now, some years after that terrifying night when I thought I might lose everything, I can look back and see the hand of Providence in what seemed like the darkest moment of our lives. The necklace still rests safely hidden, no longer a dangerous secret, but a treasured family heirloom that we will pass down to our children as a reminder of the love that overcame impossible odds. "Do you ever regret it?" Lyanna asked me just last evening as we sat before our fireplace, watching our young son play with wooden toys on the hearth. "Agreeing to marry a stranger for land and discovering you had bound yourself to secrets that could reshape kingdoms?" "Never," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "Do you regret trusting a desperate younger son with the most dangerous secret in England?" "Never," she echoed, her smile radiant in the firelight. "Though I confess I never expected to find such happiness in an arrangement that began with such deception." What I learned through this extraordinary journey is that sometimes the most terrifying choices lead to the most beautiful destinations. I thought I was trading my name for land and security, but I discovered something far more precious. I learned that true wealth cannot be measured in acres or gold, but in the depth of our connections to those we love. I discovered that real courage is not the absence of fear, but choosing to protect what matters most even when the cost seems too high to bear. The greatest treasures in life are not found in what we seek, but in what we choose to protect. Sometimes, when we stop chasing what we think we want and start defending what we discover we need, we find that we have gained everything we never knew we were looking for. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more tales of love conquering impossible odds, because the rope around my wrists that morning was real, but so was the love that ultimately set us both free.